I always watched, my father was a firefighter, and several times he'd go on a fire call and I'd get stuck in the vehicle waiting for him to return. You know, and it was the call that he thought would be just 20 minutes and turned out to be an hour. But while the trucks were out, I always kind of wandered through the fire station and that. But so it was kind of my dad that started my interest into the fire service. And then my uncle too was also in the fire department.
Well, I have to think back to when I was a kid, seeing the big red fire trucks and the noise of the sirens and plugging my ears. That was cool. And being a hometown boy of Hudson all my life, finally had the opportunity in 1989 to apply, and the rest is history.
I think one of the big things was I liked the shift work. The days, my dad was a firefighter, so that was kind of my exposure to the fire service.
I'm not sure I ever had any real interest in becoming a fireman, but again, a friend of mine asked me to join and said it was a good organization, and my family, including myself, always had a community background and always wanted to give back to the community. So again, it was a good way for me to give back to the community.
Well, I have relatives that are firefighters in my wife's family, and I always thought that it would be something kind of fun. I, like others before me, I answered an ad in the newspaper one day and thought, well, this might be interesting. Kind of a sideline to do along with your everyday kind of work. It might be something that would keep things interesting and involved in our community here.
And one day my wife happened to notice in the Hudson paper that they were hiring firefighters. So I thought, what the heck, I'll try and see what I can do. But I lived a long way out of town. I mean, I was 8 miles out of town, so I'd be a last responder. But Dean, the fire chief at the time, he said that, you know what, we could really use you with your talents, so for working on equipment, even though I do. So I was actually one of the last responders always, but a lot of times I was at the department when I was working on trucks, and which worked out, I think, pretty good over the years.
Third generation firefighter with Hudson. My mother's father, Carl Hallberg, was an engineer with the department many years ago. I don't think I can recall when that was, but for quite a while. My father, Forrest Rossing, was with the department from mid-60s into the 80s, and he was a firefighter. And of course now here's me and in the third generation spot, and I guess I'm trying to remember. I think I've got 45 years, something like that. I try not to keep track, but so far so good.
My uncle was a firefighter and engineer. He also was the captain, assistant chief, and then fire chief for 10 years. And my dad was just happy being a firefighter. And I think he was a driver too at one point. But like I said, I just kind of looked up to them and thought it'd be a nice thing or fun thing to do.
I'm the first generation firefighter in my family. My wife's family has had different cousins who have been firefighters in St. Paul and other communities. I'm very lucky that my son Mike is also a firefighter here in Hudson, who's the fire inspector here in town and currently holds the rank of lieutenant.
The ones that I remember is, I mean, it's so different today, but if they had a rural call where there were no fire hydrants, they would run the engine out. And when they were on water, they'd have to run the engine back to town, fill it, and then go back to the fire again. I just find that they were at a total disadvantage for extinguishment. They had a lot of stories, but probably not money fire related.
I think some of the bigger fires we had downtown Hudson, I remember Hotel Dibble was a big scene back in, I think that was in the late 70s. I remember that. And then I see him out in the cold winter fighting a fire. So that piqued a little interest there at that young age.
I do remember WCCO having a live story of the Dibbo Hotel being on fire. And I said to one of my friends at the time, well, we got to go to that. And we drove from Hammond to Hudson, and I stood in the corner of, very vividly remember watching the hotel being attacked by the different firefighters, standing on the corner of Walnut and 2nd Street and thinking, this is just so cool. And outside of the tragedy of the loss of property, there was no loss of life, but just watching all the communities coming together and the different departments working together, I just thought was the neatest thing.
I guess I don't have any huge specific things, but I mean, there's been some pretty big fires, the JR Ranch fire, over in the shop yards in North Hudson, that was a pretty good sized fire, the storage fire there. Accidents and things, of course, always kind of stick with you a little bit, but my career as a deputy sheriff exposed me to a lot of that as well, so a lot of stuff that I've seen.
We were in River Falls, and we were doing a live burn in a house that they had down there, and one of the instructors down there took us into this live burn, and it got a little carried away. Our shields started to melt.
So when I joined the department, fire department was underneath what is City Hall today, in the basement of that building, and then in '76 they built that new building across the street, and we moved over there, which was a great addition, gave us a lot more room. Not near the room you got here, of course, but at the time it was sufficient and very good, and hosed the fire department and the EMTs.
There's a lot of things that have changed, obviously. Some things that we don't do anymore that were pretty common in the old days were not much for protective gear, you know, a long rubber treated coat and some hip style boots were about what we had, and a helmet that was not much more than, you know, like what they wear for construction these days. No air apparatus or anything like that, no SCBA. We used to ride the tailboards of the engines, which of course nowadays is known not to be too safe, but it was quite a hairy ride sometimes, going to some pretty big calls. And I can remember, you know, hanging onto the back rail and having a couple other guys hold you there while you finish getting your gear on, sometimes putting your coat on and things like that. And
I was a very new firefighter. That's back when you could ride the tailboard. And there was a semi-trailer on fire behind what was the Erickson store downtown. And the truck had went down First Street, or Wisconsin Street to First Street, and somebody hollered, grabbed the LDH. It was a large diameter hose, so I grabbed it. I was going to wrap the hydrant, only to find out there's no fire hydrant on that corner. So they laid out the whole string of large diameter hose all the way down the street and couldn't connect to anything.
I can remember another time I was down at the department, and one of our lead engine, the starter was out of it, and I want to say a week or two before Christmas, and we had some brutal cold then. Anyways, George and I were down there that morning, and I pulled the starter out. Now these starters in these big trucks, diesel engines, they're over 100 pounds. So I get it out, I put it on my chest, and I'm wheeling out from underneath the truck, and George picks it up and puts the new starter on. We get a call. We got a structure fire about 3 blocks away from the department, and it's going. So now I'm frantically trying to get this starter into our lead engine, and everybody's coming down to take the truck, and well, they couldn't take it till I got it done. So, well, our ladder truck was also an engine. I mean, it could pump water, so they took that, and I managed to get the starter done and got my gear on. Well, I was going to get in the back of the truck, and George says, "You're driving." I was scared to death. I mean, I'd only been on the department about a year, and here I'm driving a fire truck to an actual call.
But I do recall just walking the streets of Hudson, walking around the fire department. I recall it when it was over underneath the current city hall, and was lucky enough when I was a little bit older in high school to think that what a cool building that the fire station on Walnut Street turned out to be also. Now having had the opportunity to have started my career at that same fire station and then transition here to our new station and Ward Avenue, I think of how extremely lucky we've been and how supportive the community has been over these years.
I appreciate the history, and I think if anyone that's visited the fire station here, most of the things we have on the wall is older pictures and that about the history. Of course, Hudson Fire has a great history, so I guess I enjoy all of it. No particular story in general, but and I respect the evolution and the history and what the people have been through to get to where we are today in the fire service.
I've always heard the infamous Tim Tank McGee story and always wondered why they call him Tank. And I found out he jumped on the back of a tanker and rode to a fire call, which you only do that in Hollywood movies, not in real life, I found out.
He was, we had a tanker, we called them tankers back then, and on the tailboard there was a pump, and Tim was on the back tailboard filling this motor with gasoline, and we got a call, and he was doing something else. Well, the guys jumped in the truck. Tim's still filling this motor with gas, and they took off. And he's riding the tailboard to the call. So that's how he got the name Tank. That was his nickname.
Responding to a fire, my dad and one of the other firefighters would always seem to be in the same place in the same time, timing-wise, coming to the station. And of course, you drive your own vehicle. And it was always, he always knew what the other guy was going to do. And so one day, coming back to him from a fire, or coming to a fire, the other guy put his brakes on to do something way different than he normally does. My dad wasn't really ready for it, so the rear end of the front car went up high, and my dad hit the brakes and went down low, and he scooted right underneath the back end of the other guy's car. And so they always joked about that.
Dan Raglan, who had been firefighter captain and assistant chief, always remember him as being referred to in his captain days as Captain Krabby, but when he became assistant chief, he became Chief Cheery, as long as somebody was able to bring him a cup of coffee to the fire scene.
My mother claimed my father set the back hill on fire just so he could collect his $6 for the fire call.
I think every event affects the community. For us, it's write another run. But for each individual, it's one of the biggest events of their life. So I think any one to single out, I would say no, but we've had, every fire is significant to those people, and it's a difference in their life and one of the bigger events in their life. Unfortunately, this last year we lost a person in a fire, which is tragic, and we never want to have that, and that's probably one of the worst as far as that, our only life loss we've had since I've been here.
I don't think there's that one event, but I know, obviously growing up in Hudson, you know a lot of the people, and the fact that you come across your old teachers, your old neighbors and stuff like that, it's just very gratifying to put all those memories together that you help somebody.
The largest incident I ever was involved with was the North Hudson warehouse fire. And I'll always remember that. Incidents of that magnitude, you just don't forget. It took a ton of resources to get that fire extinguished in several hours.
2 warehouse fires in North Hudson that consumed a number of resources and required mutual aid from surrounding communities up to an hour away. We've changed the way that we handle our mutual aid for large fires. A lot of our communities can support our efforts much more effectively now because of the lessons we've learned from past fires and past large events. And we don't see, hopefully we don't see as the number of large catastrophes as we've done in the past, just because of the lessons that we've learned and the way that we train to be more prepared to deal with these emergencies as they come up.
Really, I'm just one person here and part of a big group, and I've learned from everybody here. Obviously yourself, you're a great assistant chief, Jeff DeBruzzi, who's been on 42 years, I believe. But every firefighter from, I don't want to mention any particular names really, because they all have in different ways helped me grow, because like I say, I'm just one person. I'm kind of the conduit of information and knowledge and try and learn from. And we're very fortunate to have a very diverse background here. We have from pilots to businessmen to everybody, and I'm fortunate enough to learn from all of them, and the one common thread they have is their dedication to the department. And so I've actually learned way more from them than they'll ever learn from me.
I would say George Reed was the biggest influence for me. And I knew George, of course, growing up here, but he was a good instructor, and not only as far as fires, but also for working on the trucks. I used to help him work on the trucks as well, and he was a great mentor.
I remember at the time it was Lieutenant Dan Smith was one of the first people that took an interest in me and helped me get acclimated to the department. He was on one of my very first calls that I remember. Dan became captain at one point and did much of the training here for the department. Always had an interest, always was friendly, and he was a guy that represented the department well. Unfortunately, he passed away at an untimely early age, but he's somebody that I always remember and appreciate everything that he took interest in working with me.
The fire service, as you know, has great camaraderie and a tradition of that. And so there were many of the firefighters that were on at the time that I came on that had been there a long time. They themselves had some family history, etc. George Reed was a great guy. He knew a lot. He had awesome mechanical abilities and was a real even-keeled, calm sort of a guy that you could count on in a pinch, so to speak. And he put many years in the department. Chief Herb Fry was another great mentor as well. Another similar type of a personality. And he encouraged me when the time came when he was going to retire. He encouraged me to apply for the position because he felt that I'd be a good fit, I guess. So, but he was an awesome guy as well.
Guy by the name of George Reed. George was on the fire department for, many years. He was a mechanic for a local Ford dealer here in town. And George and I got along really good. And I had to learn a lot about fire engines, I tell you what. I'm a certified mechanic. I worked for Northwest Airlines for 25 years. But working on airplanes and different things out at the airport were far different than working on a fire truck. Fire trucks are very unique, and George was fun to work with. And him and I, we spent many evenings and long hours working on our trucks. Back then we had old equipment and it took a lot of care to keep them running.
Well, I think my uncle did throughout my life. He took interest in me and my potential, and but there were several people that I looked up to in joining the fire department, and I kind of shadowed those folks. Personnel changes quite often, so it was hard to grasp onto any one individual. There were several. In the later years, it was more like George Reed. I shadowed with him. George was kind of a mechanic person, and I took interest in the mechanic part of it, fixing and repairing.
Dan Raglan and John Warner were very instrumental when I first came on, and spending a lot of time with me, and just giving me the behind the scenes look and throwing me in when they thought it was right and I was at my comfort level of going into fires. So I owe a lot to Dan Baker Raglan and John Chumley Warner, who, rest in peace, is no longer with us. So.
My guess is that it was probably a grass fire at that time of year. I think it was later April. And back in the day when we had more pasture land and farmlands with the railroads coming through our district, it was pretty common to be called out several times a day to go to grass fires because of the wildland and things. So my guess is it was probably a grass fire. And in those days we didn't have much to fight those with. It was usually a pickup truck with maybe a rough pump and a hose on it, or maybe a big heavy back can. Was about all we had. So
My very first fire call, I remember, was a fire at the Hudson House. They had a standalone wood burning boiler building on the south side of the building. I had been on the department for about a week, and this was the first time my pager went off, so I wasn't really quite sure what I was supposed to do. So I went down to the fire station. I kind of watched everybody else running for their gear and getting on the trucks. Dan Smith was one that says, "Get your gear, get on the truck." And I was on our ladder truck, 3160, for the very first time. Ended up going to the fire. We stopped somewhere in the parking lot where Dan got off, so I got off too, and the truck took off and I ended up running after it. But when I got up to the fire, there was another officer who grabbed my helmet and said he needed it, so I let him do that. Later on, he might have been the same person that handed me a hose and said, start spraying some water on that red stuff. And so I did, without any helmet and maybe just a jacket on. And of course, I believe the chief at the time said, "What the heck are you doing? There's a fire over there." So I was going every which way direction, but even with all that, I thought that was the greatest thing, and haven't looked back since.
In those days, we had a lot of grass fires along the railroad tracks, not near so many nowadays, but I remember a lot of grass fires. And I remember when we got the pagers, I'm a pretty sound sleeper, and I told George, I said, there ain't no way that pager's gonna wake me up. And sure enough, it did. One night, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, it went off. I got up, and then I don't remember what the lapse was, but like 4 or 5 minutes later, they would sound it again. And that happened to me that same evening, and my wife was still laying in bed, and she says, "You're standing up sleeping there. Are you going to the fire or not?"
I'm not sure if it was the first fire call, but one of them I do remember. And we were going to the fire, and the driver asked what we want to do, and I said, put the fire out and leave. And he kind of laughed.
It was a very cold one. It was out to the cove in the old La France. And the only thing to protect us on that long drive out there was a tarp. And I was facing backwards in the middle of the night, and we'll never forget that first call because of the temperatures, the sirens, and the events that it was a huge house fire, and we were there for a long time.
I remember my first house fire was on Orange Street. I was in shorts, and back then we just had the tall rubber boots. So there was a gap between my coat, because I'm tall, my coat wasn't all that long. There's a gap between my coats and my boots, and the chief at that time gave me all kinds of heck because I wore shorts to the fire. That was before bunker pants.
A lot of things have changed over the years. As I mentioned earlier, when I got on, I had zero training. I had my first fire was within a week. Now we send our firefighters, before they ever do anything, through hours of training, through entry-level firefighter. There's firefighter Firefighter 1, Part A and B. We, on our department, want our firefighters to have that extra level of training, so they go through what's called Firefighter 2. So it takes a good 2 years of training before they are at a level that we expect them to be at this point. But at the very least, they have an entry-level portion before they ever even get on a truck and respond to any calls. So the training and the requirements are much more involved. The time commitment is a lot, and I appreciate what, as far as a community that still relies on a volunteer department, a combination department, I should say, that we're fortunate that we have people that are willing to give up that time and make that kind of commitment to be trained in the most professional ways possible.
I think the role is essentially the same. I think the requirements, the training obviously is great stuff. We've learned a lot over the years, how to protect ourselves, how to better protect our citizens and things as well. We know that there's a lot of nasty things now that we used to kind of just blow off or poo-poo. It's just good old wood smoke and things like that, and you didn't have breathing apparatus and things. And I think that if there's anything that I can relate to in that manner, I think we're doing a lot better job of educating ourselves and doing better to stay safe and to better serve the community because of that. So,
training, people don't realize the amount of training that a volunteer firefighter has to go through. I mean, basically, he's going through the same training a full-time firefighter does. Only it takes longer because we only have a few hours a night when we train. So in the requirements nowadays, I don't know how guys can do it and raise a family too. It's just, and I don't think people, the public realize the dedication that these guys have to be a volunteer fireman. I really, it's incredible. And plus the fact that the equipment now has gotten so much better than when I first got on, you and I first got on. Protective equipment is far superior to what we used to have. Yeah, to be a young guy again and be a volunteer fire department would be really difficult, but very rewarding though. It's a family. You make lasting friends forever.
79, you were a wimp if you went into the fire without an air pack on. Now today you wouldn't think about going into the fire without an air pack on. One training incident in River Falls, they sent me into the attic without an air pack on. I came out choking, puking, hecking, whatever. What's the point, you know? But we all learn from that now. Yeah, we do it much safer today.
We have a lot more nicer equipment today, and we're protected more with our turnout gear, and technology helps us in a lot of ways, communicating, and it all helps us get home safely after every call.
I used to run the engine out, and then in 1972 they got their first tender, water tender or tanker, and then of course I wasn't here then, but just enough to know what was going on. And then the equipment has greatly improved as far as reliability, as far as what's available to us, like a thermal imaging camera, 4-gas meter for monitoring air quality. The whole way we operate is way different today than it was in 1980 or 79 when I started.
You go into a burning building, you can't see, all right? The smoke can be pitch black. They came out with thermal imaging cameras. Just a fantastic tool that cuts right through that smoke so you can see where you're going, where the seat of the fire is. Just an amazing tool. Our SCBA's got lighter and smaller than they used to be, so you don't have to carry all that weight anymore. It's just, yeah, the equipment now is just amazing that they have. And the trucks are easier to operate. Computerized controls, they take care of your automatic pressures for you. You used to have to calculate it in your head. Not anymore. Now the computer does it, which is okay, because when you're under a lot of stress, that helps a lot.
From when I started, the two front-end engines had seating areas that were essentially open cabs that you pull the tarp over you to keep you somewhat dry in the winter or rain. To the engines now that have seating and seat belts for everybody, headphones so you can communicate with everybody on the truck. The engines now are so much more sophisticated and computerized that they do a lot of the thinking for themselves, although you still have to rely on your instincts and that basic training, because machinery is only as good as the people that are running it.
I remember when we bought new air tanks and masks, how much better they were than the old ones we had. That was the biggest new technology I can remember, other than equipment, of course. But that was a big deal when we bought those new air tanks and masks.
I think we've had a new rescue squad, a new engine, a new ladder truck, a new brush truck, I think 2 or 3 support vehicles. We had a UTV that was a grant and then funded by the nonprofit fundraising efforts by the firefighters. Station, some SCBAs, I guess one of the things that yourself worked on in a group of people is just creating the kind of new emblem. We had 2 different patches when we started, and then we decided we should just have one and kind of with some tradition. So those are, I guess, some of the highlights, and really I want to thank the mayor and the council for supporting us and allowing us to get this equipment and facilities. It's without them we wouldn't have it, but without the firefighters we wouldn't have it. So they're the ones that use it and need it and give it back to our community. So.
I remember a couple guys. There's Don Helt, who's been on our department, who was always a big burly guy, and I think at sometimes part-time bouncer at some of the local establishments downtown Hudson, and there's everybody's been a character in their own right, and I can say that we have people who are still emerging in finding their place on our department now.
Well, there's been a lot of characters. Let me just say that it's always a great friendship, camaraderie. You know that you could come to the fire station and anybody there was just like your friend, you know, and so you could sit down and have a conversation and a laugh with anybody. We used to play cards after our meeting nights and things like that, and plenty of them, I should say. L.D. Fry was a great character. He always had a smile and a great disposition and laugh. I really admired that about him, and he was here a long time, and even in his later years you'd see LD in the middle of the night, you know, and whether or not that was because he couldn't sleep or whatever, but he was always here, and that's one person I guess I would say that's a character, of course. Bob Jensen, he's passed now quite a while, but you know, Bob used to come in and make jokes and things like that, and back in the old days when we used to have beer that was available or around the fire station, which has been a long past. Bob made a joke one time. We were at a hot day on a grass fire, and this is, you got to understand, this is many, many years back, but we literally had just a small little radio system, and it was hot, and they were out on the scene of a grass fire finishing up, and he called back to the station, and he thought he'd be a little tricky and he would disguise what he was asking for. So he said, send us out a pack 12 to the scene, just in case somebody was listening. But back in those days, it was something that probably might have happened. But that's kind of, I always look at that as something funny.
Chumley and Chumley was a good guy. It's sad that he passed away at such an early age. Very good firefighter. If you went into a burning building, he's one of the guys you'd want to have with you because he knew what to do. Good at his job. Yeah. Trying to remember Donnie. Donnie from the mobile station, Colbeth. Donnie was a real character. He would literally, he owned a business in Hudson, a small little repair garage, but he would take his paychecks that he would get and he would go and buy us steaks for dinner on our meeting nights, and that was pretty cool. Pretty neat of that guy, but Donnie was something else. Another one that's very much missed. Yep.
For sure, Donnie Colbeth. Only because not only of his true character, but the smell of the kitchen when he cooked. It was nothing but smoke. And you can never forget that and get it out of your system. So, Donnie Colbeth.
One of the funniest ones was C.P. Knuckleby. He lived right across the street on 3rd Street. And A lot of times we would go to the fire hall and just hang out or play cards or whatever. If CP would walk in the fire hall when we were there and no real fire going on, he had it down. He could sound the siren with his mouth, and we'd all jump up and get going. Then we see Nuck, and then we knew it was a false call. But it was crazy how he could sound the siren with his mouth.
I've never thought about that. I mean, I'd like to think the longevity of being on there 30, 40, I mean, it's gonna have to take me out before I leave this place. Just like my golf game. You know, everybody wants to die on a golf course. I may wanna end it on a fire scene.
That I gave all I could give. I did what I could do, and I enjoyed being here.
A guy that took care of the equipment, and a guy that I tried to be happy all the time, and a friend to everybody. So yeah, I guess that's how I'd like to be remembered. A good friend.
I guess in general, I hope that by some of the things I was able to do in a chief position, that I left the department in better condition than I found it. Not that it was in bad shape, but did some innovations and things that helped. Of course, over the years, the other chiefs that have followed me have done well as well. And so I guess if anything, that I was fair with all the things, and that hopefully the little bit that I did for the community and things, that I made that better too. So I guess that's all that anybody can ask. So
I hope people look at what I've done here and been sincere about my commitment to the community and my dedication to the department. You like to think that you've left something in a better shape than when you found it. I like to think that that's been the case, and hopefully that people can take those building blocks set in place by myself and others, and continue moving forward as we develop to meet all of our needs in our community.
So I would just like to be remembered as being involved in the community and giving back to the community. And you're not on the fire department to make $1 million or a big pension or anything. It's your duty to give back to the community that you live in, and that's how I'd like to be remembered.
When I started, I said this, I think at the time the fire department had been around 141 or 2 years, and I said, I just hope I don't screw it up, because it's ran that long without me, and hopefully in my tenure here I don't screw it up. So that's my goal.